Hello? Can you guys hear me? Hello, hello. Okay, I would like to welcome you to the second part of session number 4, the Healthy Marine Arctic Ecosystems, Coexistence and Adaptive Management. So my name is Malin Johansen. I work as an advisor for the Norwegian Polar Institute. And this part of the session will have a stronger focus on integrated monitoring, risk assessment, and adaptive management. The Arctic oceans and coastal waters and the natural resources are facing pressures from multiple human activities in addition to climate change. And it's now more than ever important to have an adaptive management approach with integrated monitoring and risk assessment to identify and manage multiple stressors on marine Arctic ecosystems. So in this session, we are going to dive into these challenges and look at how new research and approaches can give a better understanding of how multiple stressors can affect the marine ecosystems in these areas, and how adaptive management can be a tool to achieve sustainable development and conserve biodiversity. So the first speaker today is going to be online. It's Katrine Stefansen from Aquaplaniva. She works as a senior advisor there. And she will present the ERA Acute and how this method now has been expanded to include the marginal ice zone.
Okay, can you hear me? I cannot share my screen. I seem to not be able to share my screen.
He's working on it, but we can maybe try to share it from here. Is that a possibility, or?
Yes, I've made a few slight changes, but I can see if I can manage without, if it can't be done.
Okay, so now we have your slides, at least here in the...
All right,
yeah.
Okay, I can't see them from here, so I won't know. Shall I ask you to change the slide for me?
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, because I can't point. There is no possibility to share from here?
Or I thought you could, but you can try. I don't know if what happened on your computer that makes you not
And
able.
the host has disabled participant screen sharing. So you need to enable sharing for me to do that.
Okay. Yeah. No.
It's easier for me to point when I can see what I'm pointing at.
I'm also maybe then thinking that we can start with Sabine, or we can just continue. Okay, I can try to change this slides for you when you tell me. That's how we can do it now.
All right, it's quite difficult to present because I only see I see you, and I really don't see my slides. Okay, I shall present using my presentation. If you go to the first slide, thank you for allowing me, first of all, to present online. Due to cancelled flights, I wasn't able to be there in person. I'm here in behalf of my co-authors to present ERA Acute for the marginal ice zone. And first of all, if you go to the first slide, what is ERA Acute? It's the current standard environmental risk assessment methodology for oil spills on the Norwegian continental shelf. And environmental risk assessments are mandatory analyses for applications for activities. ERA Acute currently covers seabirds, marine mammals, fish resources, and shoreline, and we call these resources valued ecosystem components, or abbreviated VECs. Now, ERA Acute as a methodology is subject to continuous improvement and development. And one of the recent developments is the ERA Acute for the marginal ice zone, which is new. So if you go to the next slide, please. The marginal ice zone in ERAQ context is considered an ecosystem or a VEC or a habitat VEC, as it has a value for many other species, and this value is tied to its seasonal attractiveness, which is tied to the productivity of the marginal ice zone. The primary and secondary producers that bloom in succession are used as value indicators. And we have four VEC subgroups, as we might call them. And these are the ice algae, the ice-associated zooplankton, which both can be exposed to oil that's under the ice. And we have the phytoplankton and the pelagic zooplankton that can be exposed to oil in the water column. And in ERAQ, we enter the oil spill simulations from an external model, and we redistribute the surface oil to being partly under the ice. So in order to make ERAQ for the marginal ice zone, we needed a system to identify the most vulnerable areas and the most vulnerable periods. And therefore, we wanted to score the vulnerability in time and space in a manner that was simplified and robust. So if you go to the next slide, please. So we're using georeferenced VEC data and georeferenced oil spill data in ERAQ. That means that all the data that we used are entered on a user-defined grid. And we use the vulnerability. Now, I can't really see the screen and the slides then. I made a few changes here. But we use the productivity as a value basis for these four VEC groups that we have defined. Now, we're not actually using VEC data for these primary and secondary producers, but we are tying their, sorry, the screen is jumping here for me. There is a high complexity of environmental factors that drive the bloom and the succession of the bloom, and we've simplified this so that we have two major data input sources. One is the daily distribution of sea ice concentrations or sea ice cover, measured as daily distributions and the percentage of the grid cell that is covered by ice. And we can therefore follow the retraction of the ice during the spring melt that goes from the largest extent in the late winter to the smallest extent in the late summer. And if you see this figure by Eva Loy et al., who tied the bloom of the two primary producer groups, the ice algae and the phytoplankton, to the latitude and the month, we are using this tied to the ice concentration or the ice level of on the surface in each month. And by using data and daily data sets, we follow the dynamics of melting and freezing and the movements. And since this is ERAQ and we're measuring the impacts of oil spills, we use the oil spill exposure. In this case, it's the oil under the ice and the water concentrations. So if you go to the next slide, please. That was the final one. One up. Right, so to connect the ice concentration data or the ice density data with the month and the different VEC groups, we have designed the bloom intensity factor scoring system. And this is designed to give a vulnerability weight to the impact based on the bloom intensity of each of these four groups of producer VECs. So the impact that's calculated in the grid cell from exposure to oil is assigned a BIF weighting, which is dependent on the ice density in intervals and the month in question. So we can follow the peak of the bloom by the weight of the BIF value. So if there's a BIF value of 1, there is no added weight. And if the BIF value is 2, the exposure to oil is multiplied by the weight, and the impact in the cell is given a double weight. So when we have a map, like you see on the right-hand side, this map is the map of the impact to one of these VEC groups, and it is weighted by both the exposure to oil, the amount of oil in the cell, as well as this vulnerability BIF scoring factor. Now, the values are based on literature and scientific judgment of the importance of ice cover and the ice cover interval and the particular date or the month. And this literature includes the importance of temperature and salinity, the nutrients and how they're depleted, light levels, etc. And all these things are then assigned to this grid cell through the BIF value, which sort of represents all this complexity. We also have considerations, for example, of the preference for each of these VEC groups for the different concentration intervals, and to include the potential for or the vulnerability due to climate change. We have assigned a higher weight to higher ice densities, where there could be a probability of a higher probability of multi-year ice, which, for example, is particularly important to certain red-listed species of zooplankton. So our system can be further developed to assign weight and assign importance to particular areas of the marginal ice zone, so that we can model impacts of other anthropogenic stresses. And for ERA acute in itself, we can also, in future development, include particular data sets of areas that have particularly high densities of planktonic organisms, so that we can refine ERA acute further. So that was the, if you go to the final slide, I would like to thank you for your attention, and also thank our project partners in ERA acute, Ms. Dynamic, and also the other participants in the science team. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm so sorry for that issue with the technology. I'm sorry. And next we have Arnaud Tarot from NINA, the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. He's also going to present online, but now the technology should be working, so he can share his screen. So he will present to us a large-scale assessment of the spatio-temporal overlap between seabirds and 2 large anthropogenic stressors, industrial fishing and maritime traffic.
Can you hear me well? I hope so.
Yes, we can. It's perfect.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here today, watching my presentation. I could unfortunately not be with you physically this time, but you're more than welcome to take contact with me using this email address if you have questions or comments following this presentation. So I'm going to talk today about seabirds and some of the main threats they are facing over the ocean. As you probably know, seabirds are not exactly doing great these days, but 2 numbers first. 30%. This is the proportion of seabird species that are considered as being globally threatened. And 57%. This is the proportion of species whose populations are currently declining, seabird species, of course. There are multiple reports and studies addressing these issues now, and it is clear that seabirds are facing a large variety of threats at sea, from climate change to pollution and human activities. So our study is articulated around one main question, which is, what are the spatial temporal dynamics of the exposure of seabirds to these threats? In other words, where and when do the distributions of seabirds and their potential stressors overlap? We were interested here in 6 seabird species breeding in the Arctic. These species are pelagic, which means they wander far offshore, for example, when migrating or wintering in the Northeast Atlantic Ocean. And we focused on two stressors, industrial fisheries and ship traffic, which are widespread and intensive in both inshore and offshore remote international waters. So both stressors have increased in intensity in the last decades, as we can see on these two figures here. So to answer that question, we used a relatively straightforward approach where we estimate the overlap between spatial distribution of seabirds and that of the corresponding stressors. Because we are also interested in the temporal dynamics, we use monthly distribution data sets and thus obtain one estimate of overlap for each month of the year. So note that these monthly distributions are averages over several years, that is aggregated data, right? So I'm going to talk now a little bit about the methods and data sets we've been using before presenting some of the results. So the seabird distribution data set that we used comes from the SeaTrack project, which you may have heard already about earlier today from my colleague Halvard Ström from the Norwegian Polar Institute when he presented the project in the part one of this session this morning. Briefly, we used several years of daily tracking data to model the habitat use of species using species distribution models, and then weighted these models using population data for each species and each colony that you can see on these maps here as black dots. Note that we're currently covering breeding colonies from Russia to Iceland. I mean currently, like in the current study I'm presenting now, but we are actually working on incorporating data from Greenland and Canada to enhance our models for the entire North Atlantic, as Halvard presented earlier today. So the next data set is about industrial fishing effort, and it comes from the freely distributed Global Fishing Watch data set. This high resolution data set was aggregated to match the resolution of the seabird distribution data. And the fishing effort data are available by fishing gear category, for example, long lines, purse seines, trawlers, and so on, which is very interesting for us, as we can use this specific gears depending on how vulnerable each seabird species is to each gear or fishing gear. Finally, data on the industrial fishing effort come from the freely distributed global fishing, data on the ship traffic were obtained through the Norwegian Coastal Administration, who provided us with an AIS dataset covering our entire study area. And here as well, the data were aggregated to match the spatial temporal resolution of our seabird distribution data. And these data are also available for various ship categories, such as cargo, tankers, passenger ships, etc. So here's an overview of the results we have obtained. On the left, you can see the yearly average exposure to industrial fishing for all 6 seabird species combined. So this is an average both throughout the year and for all species, right? And you can clearly see some hotspots, notably around Iceland and the United Kingdoms, as well as in the North Sea and the Barents Sea. On the right, you can see the overlap between seabirds this time and ship traffic, and the picture seems at first very similar to what we observed with fishing activity. If we look more into detail from the monthly estimates of overlap, we can extract the proportion of each population and species that is exposed to each threat during a given month. And there is a lot of variation among species here. For example, little auks seem to be little exposed to fisheries, and this throughout the year, while black-legged kittiwakes and northern fulmars are much more exposed, especially during the breeding season in summer. This seems partly due to the behavior of the species, which are very mobile and widespread, but also by the due to the fact that they are more sensitive to certain types of fishing gear or fishing gear such as long lines, for example, which are widely used far offshore in international waters. These patterns are exemplified here with the Atlantic puffin on the left side, which is a diving species that spends a lot of time on the water, and on the right side with the northern fulmar, which is a highly mobile seabird that covers large distances during all periods of the year. So in November, both species are on their way to or already in their wintering areas. But you can see that fulmars are substantially more exposed to fisheries than puffins during that month, at least. In this study, we're also looking at the temporal dynamics of seabird exposure to human activities. And here you can see how exposure to fishing activity varies throughout the year for another species, the black-legged kittiwake. And note here how the level of exposure becomes lower and kind of more diffuse during the winter month when the species spreads out over most of the North Atlantic Ocean. This is, of course, very important is to understand not only where, but also when seabirds are most vulnerable to human stressors. This last slide of results for today shows the variation in exposure to ship traffic with two highlights here. Firstly, there seems to be less variation among species, at least for this period, and when comparing the Atlantic puffin and the northern fulmar. But secondly, the exposure to ship traffic is very widespread, even though some areas like the North Sea or the Barents Sea have higher levels due to higher densities of shipping lanes in those areas. To conclude, seabirds face a very dynamic landscape of threats, reaching far out in the open ocean and covering all periods of the year. We are starting now to understand how variable the exposure to threats is, both in space and time. And these aspects must be taken into account if we are to implement effective conservation measures for seabirds and for marine ecosystems as a whole. We are for now focusing on exposure to stressors in this study, but ultimately the goal is to understand how these activities can affect the survival and reproduction of seabirds. Additional stressors such as climate change or pollution, which have been actually mentioned earlier in earlier presentations today, also need to be considered as they will likely have combined cumulative effects on seabird populations. And just before finishing, I wanted to acknowledge all the co-authors and partners in this project who are actively participating in this study. As you can see, we are many. And finally, I want to thank all our project partners and not least the Arctic Frontiers Organizing Committee for giving us the opportunity to present our work here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello. You hear me? Okay. I'm gonna just try without, but then I know the. I'm gonna try without. Sorry, I know you're not gonna hear. Thank you for that very interesting presentation. And next, we're gonna welcome Sabine Cochran to the stage. She's a senior researcher at Akolhoniva. And she will give us some information about the Morbifus project. I'm not sure how to say that, but welcome. You want to switch me on? I think it's it should be on. Am I on?
No. Yes, now I'm on.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for introducing me and also for the invitation to join you here today in person. I'm just going to give you a very short and not very scientific snapshot of a rather large EU project. Sorry, can someone just tell me how to work this thing? The green one? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Morbifus, in a nutshell, is concerned with marine biodiversity, ecosystem functioning, and the services that human beings are taking from these ecosystems. It's quite a large partnership. It will finish, I forgot to put it here, we will be working until 2026. We have 6 main scientific work packages, and I'm just going to concentrate mostly on the first one here. I'll just give you a bit of a fun overview. We start with the stakeholders because this is really important. Who wants our science? And we are using the stakeholders to co-design our products, and to make sure that what we produce is actually going to be used in a good way by our stakeholders. So the stakeholders have been involved right from the proposal writing stage and will be throughout. We have a number of study sites. We are working on further developing from state-of-the-art a range of innovative monitoring and assessment tools. We're working on the ecological, social, and economic assessment of the values in different ways. And then work package 5 here, this is a really fun one. We're looking how to integrate these into a range of both management scenarios. What kind of, do we care about the environment at all? What would happen if we make industrial world where we don't care about environmental protection? How will that work then in various climatic scenarios and across Europe? Or the other way around, how much conservation do we need to use? And what would happen if we have different environmental management strategies in different climatic and different geographic situations? So, and finally, this is one that Aquaplan Niva and myself and some colleagues are working on. It's quite a challenge. We want to take the entire project and make sure that we can implement what we're finding from local scales to European scales and also beyond. So we have some international partners beyond Europe. So, okay. Here are our study sites. We've got a total of 12 different study sites located across the 4 main European seas. Together with the Institute of Oceanology in Poland, we are responsible for the northern ones. So that's both Svalbard and Porsangerfjorden. These are they're both Arctic, but they're very, very different demographics, where this Porsangerfjord is a very rural area and mostly based on fishing communities, and it has a very strong indigenous Sami and Kven populations who are very strongly connected with the nature. Whereas, as you know, I'll come back to this, but Svalbard has changed from a mining civilization to now it's a major global hub for research and tourism. So that's our 2 study sites. We have we spent a week in each of these areas, and we interviewed stakeholders in their territory, in their own places. We traveled to them. And we did it in 2 ways. I wasn't involved in the actual interviews, but this nice guy who's standing there was leading this. And we asked the one question: how do you see the relationship between nature, society, and economy in your region? So we let them talk for about 15 minutes, and I was noting down. And we asked them, you can see here, we made keywords. And we asked them then to put these on magnetic cards. It was a lot of fun. They loved this thing, no digital whatsoever. And we asked them to draw lines and linkages and weight these linkages. What is influencing what, and what has a positive and negative effect on what? And then we had a survey where we had 7, it was a card game. We had 7 different categories, from societal, economics, and environmental, cultural, spiritual, these different things. And we asked them to rank different values in order of importance. So we did 30 interviews in the Arctic and 250 interviews in total across Europe. And one of the things that was really funny or interesting is that our Arctic area came really far down on how people value nature protection. And we thought this was really weird because Norwegian people really like the nature. But what is actually interesting here is because in our area, people are not so concerned about high population density. On the contrary, well, Longyearbyen's having a problem now, it's getting building and building, but on Porsanger, they're mostly worried about people moving out of the area. So they're not really so, they have there is an attitude, we have a lot of nature, there's enough for everyone, so we don't need to worry too much about nature conservation. Sport is a funny one, because on Svalbard, snow scooters on the ice, it's not really sport as such, it's a method of transport to get to your cabins, and a bit of paddling. But in Porsanger, most people who live there, they wouldn't be seen dead in a kayak. Everybody, self-respecting person, has a small boat, but you need to do something purposeful, so you need your fishing rod, and then you're gathering food, and that means you can enjoy your nature, but it's in Norwegian targeted recreation. So as long as you've got your fishing rod and you bring some food back for your table, you're doing fine. So these things, the reason why these are interesting is it shows that a one-size-fits-all management policy is not going to do it across Europe. So anyway, I'm just going to hop back up to Svalbard. The take-home message from this map here is the red parts are the areas which are experiencing the most marked climatic change, melting of glaciers and reduction of sea ice. But funnily enough, these areas are precisely the areas that are being targeted by adventure tourism. This picture sort of says itself. We were in Longyearbyen exactly when this big ship appeared. Suddenly there were 6,000 people, tourists wandering around Longyearbyen, wondering what to do. Where do they get their cup of coffee from? And this really just shows that we need this balance between how many people can we take to experience the Arctic without damaging it. And I will just say that the governments of Svalbard from this year will no longer permit such large ships. They will be not allowed to take more than 750 tourists. And there's more emphasis on this small-scale adventure tourism. But of course, there'll be more boats. If you look at the AIS tracking around this time, I should have made a photo, but during that time in June, July, August, the coast of Svalbard is just pocked. You know, there's dots all around Svalbard with these kind of small ships and the big ones. But anyway, that just shows the need here. There's an urgent need for adapted management scenarios, which is not just the same all across Europe or internationally. So that's all I really wanted to say, and thank you very much. And you will find, if you just find us on the website, marbeffes.eu, then you can find more and contact me anyway.
Was very interesting. And I'm gonna just save the questions to the end of the session. Then we're gonna have a Q&A then. So now I wanna welcome up Anne Fria. She's a senior researcher at the Institute of Marine Research. And she will present a study about harbor porpoises and history parameters and their sensitivity to anthropogenic stressors. Is this on? I think he's gonna put it on. You can try again. But I think he controls it. I need to press something. No. Is it on? Yeah.
But the sound is on. Do I need to hold it?
No.
Okay. Yes. So now we're going back to a rather small study. Started out as a small study anyway. Can I move forwards and backwards?
Yeah, it's the big in the middle.
Yep. Yeah. So this is the title. This is a paper which is for hopefully in the final stages of revision. And it started out as a small project under the Fram Center here in Tromsø. We were just going to do some standard estimation of harbor porpoise life history parameters for a Norwegian sample. And then it morphed into something rather bigger because we found out that there were a lot of, when we wanted to put this into context, there was actually a lot of methodological differences that have to be taken into account. So, just to present the species, this is in that red circle there, this is what you mostly see of the hopperpoppers. It's one of the smallest whale species in the world. It's for sure the smallest whale species here in Norway. It's very coastal. It's distributed over the northern hemisphere, but with some hotspots, for instance, in the Northeast Atlantic in the North Sea, as we'll come back to. And they're mainly coastal, which means that they're in an area with a lot of human activity, and also activity from other species, and we've just put them up there. All the challenges that the hopperpoppers have to cope with. We've got one up here in the corner, or to the right here, left for you, a warship with a sonar, and this hopperpoppers are known to be sensitive to this kind of sound, also to ship noise that we've shown down below, and also to noise and activities from offshore wind farms. And as you can see, some of them wind up in gill nets, actually quite a lot of them, and it's a big problem. And up in the corner there you see a box of sardines, signifying that hopperpoppers are eating a lot of commercial fish species, sardines in the English Channel. Up here it's Seith, so they're also exposed to competition with fisheries, for instance. And then down in the corner here we have a stranded porpoise. That happens quite a lot. And in some areas it's thought to be related to diseases and high levels of contaminants, because they're high up in the food chain, and they are toothed whales, and they are poor at dealing with contaminants. And they're actually also beaten up by killer whales and by grey seals and by bottlenose dolphins, so life is hard for the hopperpoppers. Nevertheless, it is the most abundant stationary whale in the Northeast Atlantic and also in Norwegian waters. And just to show here our area, the porpoise densities, if you just look at the darker the color, the higher the density. And this is within an area of the Northeast Atlantic, or the area where we have the best data on porpoise densities and abundance, because there has been surveys going on since 1994, every 10th year. And surprisingly enough, the overall abundance within the greater North Sea area is actually pretty constant, around 350,000. Although this area, as you can see up here, and which was also shown before, it's quite noisy. There's a lot of traffic. There's a lot of human activity. So several challenges there. And as I showed you before, a lot of hopperpoppers wind up in gill nets, and that's a big problem in Norwegian waters. It has been shown that hopperpoppers bycatches. It's been a little bit back and forth how you've modeled the bycatch in relation to the abundance, whether it's sustainable or not. But once the modelers decided that we have to split up the area in 4 different units, then it actually turned out pretty clear that the northern and the northwestern, you see the red and the green, and also perhaps the western area there, have unsustainable levels of hopperpoppers bycatches. So it's quite important. Into these models go a lot of, or some life history variables, pregnancy, age and maturity of females, and pregnancy rates of females. So that's one of the reasons why it was important for us to estimate these parameters for Norwegian bycatches. And so in 2016 and 2017, we retrieved 134 hopperpoppers from bicot hopperpoppers caught along the Norwegian coast. And one of the reasons why this is important, if you look into the literature, there is actually quite a lot of variability, like 80 to 50% maturity varies from 2.9 to 5.5 years in the literature, and maximum estimated age of females, I'm talking only about females, the paper deals also with males, but I'm focused on the females. So a maximum estimated age between 7 and 24 years, that's a big difference. And also pregnancy rates, you have between 58 and 100% for trauma-killed hippopotamuses, that is by-caught or hunted samples. And then you have between 34.5 to 72% for mixed cause of death scenarios, which occur in stranded samples. There you also have animals that are dead due to infectious diseases and so on. So it appears that it makes a difference where you source your animals. Also, asymptotic lengths vary quite a lot. And so there we've shown you already, this is the first methodological problem, where do you get your animals? And the first two categories there, bycatches and some hunting of trauma, which means you have trauma-killed animals, animals that were likely well or just not biased towards unhealthy animals. They're called trauma. We categorize these as trauma-killed animals. Then you've got strandings, which is a mix of cause of death. And then you have a few studies that are trying to deduce these life history variables from captive animals or observation studies. They will have very low ends, and you can argue whether our captive studies representative. Observational studies maybe. It's interesting, but there are very few of those studies. And so when we were, I think I showed you the distribution of our samples. So they were actually biased towards the northern and the northwestern areas, and we had 4 areas. So what do we do when we lack life history variables for some areas? Either in or areas or time periods or whatever. There is one opportunity, call a friend, which in the scientific world can be translated into something called expert elicitation frameworks, where you actually invite a lot of experts simply to guess what would be the likely pregnancy rate of animals exposed to this and these conditions. That has been done, and it is being used. And then there's also some have started just simply to collect all the studies that we have, all the data that we have, and run meta-analyses on something like pregnancy rates, for instance, or age of maturity. There's a study there by Iseldijk et al. Very interesting, but there are some gaps and some problems. Yeah. One of the things that we found out, they said this thing with the age. You have a large spread in the maximum ages, and even within studies, those that are circled there are within studies. So something maybe suggests that you have methodological differences in practices, although people refer to the same protocols. I don't have time to go into this in great detail, but I can tell you that most people, when they estimate age of hippopotamus, they look at these layers, one dark, one light, that's an annual layer, and they count them. That is the dentine. And then you have cementum out here, which is shown there as well. Smaller layers, this gets difficult because it's filled up. This tissue here can grow more freely. And this is one example of an animal that was aged at 4 years by dentine and at 22 years by the cementum. So that's one example of how different things can be. Yeah. So that's one of the things that we looked into, and one of the other things that we found is that there are seasonal differences because some of these layers are closed before the calving season. That means that in your spring samples, you may have differences between readers. And that translates into differences in mean age maturity, which is these seasonal differences affect the younger animals, and it affects the mean age of maturity, whereas the maximum ages affect the asymptotic lengths. So, the last one. What we did was for the final analysis of pregnancy rates is that we collected all the data that was presented in this meta-analysis, and we ran it again with taking cause of death into account, trauma-killed versus mixed cause of death. And as you can see here, in the upper 4 there, it makes a huge difference. Actually, that we also tested the effect of mean energy density, cumulative human impacts and index, ship noise, and PCB. And of these factors, the mean energetic density of the diet was the most important factor in both our study and the previous study. But if we pull out the trauma killed only in the lower picture there, or the lower panel, the only significant single predictor is actually noise. So, methods makes a difference. Did I make it? Okay.
Thank you so much for that talk. And next, I want to welcome Catherine Dunlop. She's a researcher from the Institute of Marine Research, and she will talk about the FRAM program Coast Shifts. Yeah.
Are coming up. So yeah, my name's Cathy Dunlop. I'm from the Institute of Marine Research based here in Tromsø. I work with research which aims to monitor, minimize and manage negative impacts from coastal anthropogenic pressures, particularly on benthic ecosystems. But the last couple of years I've been working with the Coast Shift project, and this is one of those large FRAM programs which was set up 2 years ago. So it's a bit of a story of me of expanding my horizons away from the benthos into more sort of cumulative risk assessments on the coast. So food and the coast are key to northern Norway's history and future. Historically, coastal fisheries have been at the heart of northern communities. And 50 years ago, around 50 years ago, was the first salmon fish farms began appearing in the fjords. And these have increased in size and production. We also have agriculture on the land, important for rearing of animals, also reindeer. And then we have these also other food systems coming in on the land. Coastal land is berry and mushroom picking. That's popular not just for food, but also for recreation. And also we have these new methods of food production coming into the north, such as seaweed growing and land-based fish farms. So food production, we know that has environmental consequences, but this can be on very different scales, and the overall impact varies very much between different sectors. The slide here, that's just showing kind of a sort of global overview of environmental impacts from food systems. But then we have individual food systems. This is just one example, which is open cage aquaculture, and they have their own complex array of impacts and pressures that impact different ecological groups. My research up to date is mainly focusing on the link of the aquaculture impacts on the benthic ecosystem. And as many researchers in the FRAM Centre also have knowledge on several different pressures from different anthropogenic impacts on different ecological groups. And we've seen some examples today from Arnaud and also from Anna Christina just now. But with several coastal food systems in the sea and on the land, it's important that researchers and management must consider the collective impact on these ecosystems together. So that's what we're addressing in Coast Shift. We've seen that the past transitions in food production in the north, it's led to changes in how people use the coastal land, and also how it impacts northern ecosystems. But what does the future hold? So the CoastShift project has brought together researchers from 9 institutes here at the Fram Centre, and this is to develop and communicate relevant knowledge on the future direction of Northern Norwegian food systems. And we also want to examine what do these different scenarios mean for ecological consequences. So we are assessing the risk of pressures from multiple food systems, and we're doing this, we've been working mainly now in the current situation. So we're working not just with marine coastal ecological groups, but also terrestrial and freshwater. And the coastal food systems we are considering, it's in agriculture, aquaculture, fisheries, recreational fisheries, harvesting and hunting. And when we talk about pressures from these sectors, you can see in this diagram here, we're referring to physical and chemical or biological pressures. And these can be linked to several sectors. For example, noise is produced by several of those food-producing sectors. And when we're talking about ecological components, currently we're dealing with quite broad groups, so such as seabirds, marine mammals, and benthic invertebrates. So how best to organize all of this information? So we have many researchers involved. We're bringing a lot of knowledge together. And within CoastShift, we're adapted this system. It's the options for delivering ecosystem-based marine management. So this is the framework that we're using. So the ODEM is a form of DIPSEER, which we heard about one of the earlier sessions today. And the DIPSEER, this is drivers, pressures, state impact, and responses. And the ODEM system has been identified as a highly effective cumulative risk assessment method. And it's scoring top, particularly due to flexibility, adaptability, and ease of use. And this was in a recent review in an ICES workshop. So the basis of the assessment is a framework is the connections between the food sectors, their associated pressures, and ecological components. Okay, so we're in the business of assessing risk. So risk of negative impact is a factor of exposure, so that's considering exposure in space and time, and also vulnerability. So when we're trying to assess that spatial overlap between the pressures and the ecological components, we have this, oh sorry, it's not gone into the next one. We have this system where we have these quite broad categories. So there's 4 categories there. So no overlap would have the lowest score, and widespread overlap would have the highest score. So we can think about this maybe in the wind situation here in Tromsø. When you're thinking about, well, there's wind everywhere at the moment, but then when you have the overlap of that with people joining Arctic frontiers. So we also want to think about temporal exposure, and this is referring to frequency of occurrence of overlap of the pressures and ecological groups. So here, for example, there's maybe the common frequency of occurrence of exposure to the pressure of wind is people who are maybe going out for a cigarette quite often, and maybe the rare ones would be the people who are spending a lot of time discussing here at Arctic Frontiers and not going out in the wind very often. So from the exposure, we're kind of getting those broad categories. And when we're looking at vulnerability of the marine ecological groups, this is considering their sort of the genetic severity of those pressures on those groups. And we also considered the resilience of the ecological groups. And this information has come from, there was a large review published recently, which took in much expert information on the vulnerability of those ecological groups. So that's what we're using as our basis for our assessment now. We also look at the persistence of the pressure, and this is a measure of the length of time it would take for the pressure associated with a particular activity to disappear after cessation. So the take-home message from all of this is that we're getting, you get these sort of these scores build up, and then that allows you to actually look at the information in many different ways. So what sector is having the largest impact, which pressures are having the sort of different relative impact, and then you can actually look on what levels on different ecological groups. And this can be done by comparing against different areas, which is something that's coming out in a paper published through a previous project, Coast Risk, and also Coast Shift, coming out soon. But we've also know that the food systems are going to increase in the future with increased demand for food. So how will the future of food production in Norway truly look like? And my colleague Tamar will present next, and he's going to present 4 of these future scenarios for food production in northern Norway. And us working with ecological risk assessment, we'll be taking those future scenarios and building cumulative risk assessments to make a comparison between the risks that we see now on coastal ecological groups and how that will compare between different future scenarios. And the main aim is for that to be used by us and also managers to compare ecological risk between different food system scenarios in the future here in northern Norway. So I see I only have 20 seconds left, and that just leaves to particularly thank all our great colleagues in the Coast Shift programme, which is funded by the Climate Environment Department here in Norway through the Fram Centre. My colleague Hans Christian Strand and myself, we are leading the project. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And as you mentioned, next up is Tamer Abduallah from the University of Tromsø. And he's then going to continue this talk about the coast shifts and the 4 scenarios.
Hello. Yes. Good. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present the work here, and I would like to thank Cassie for the introduction, for her talk. As presented by Cassie, this is a big project. We have several work packages, and at Tromsø University, we are leading work package number 1, which are mainly aimed to study and develop blue growth and green shift scenarios for the coast of North Norway. And in this work package, we try to find the key drivers, the barriers, the expected impact, and the pathway to sustainability. Before I present you the key results that we found so far, I would like to show you hints about the different tasks of this work package in order to link things together. So the first task is task 1 about identifying the criteria of transition to sustainable based on the EU taxonomy. And in this task, we are studying the different drivers, the barrier, and the different enablers. Task number 2 is to define social and environmental and economic indicators. So this task actually aim to collect different indicators that will be used later in order to adjust and to see and validate our scenarios. Task number 3 is to develop exploratory blue growth and green shift scenarios. And the talk today actually mainly about this task, so I will present you in 2 minutes the result of this task. Task 4 is to develop target-based scenario, and I will tell you what's the difference between exploratory-based scenario and target-based scenario. And the last task actually is to develop a socioeconomic modeling to model the target-based scenario using the criteria or the indicators from task 2 to see if this scenario, this target-based scenario is valid or not. So as a very fast presentation of the result, we did policy framework analysis, and we found from this policy framework analysis that Norway used regulation to a limited degree as a tool to steer and accelerate aquaculture activity toward environmental sustainability. This means that there is untapped potential exists to steer and accelerate our aquaculture activity. So we still have like a space to frame a new laws, new regulation in order to go forward. And actually the EU taxonomy regulation could be used as a standard or as a reference point in this new framework or this new regulation. Then we start to work a bit with driver and barrier, and this is just a methodology slide to show you how we did that. First of all, we did literature review analysis. We collected from this literature review analysis around 280 factors. And after that, we reach out to expert group in order to ask them, in order to involve them in the discussion, in order to refine this 280 factor or enrich them. And after that, we start to run several internal workshops between the work package member and the cost shift member to re-evaluate the results. And this is just an example of what we got. Actually, this is published in the Framform 2023. And you can see, for example, lack of a common understanding between the stakeholders. This is a barrier. Lack of collaboration is also a barrier. But if we, for example, we start to share the knowledge and the awareness between us, this can be driver. If we start to have like attitude of a change, we need to change things among us, this is also can be a driver. So this is just a snapshot for the driver and the barrier that we extracted from this analysis. Based on this driver and barrier, we succeeded to formulate 4 exploratory blue growth scenarios. This is what I will present now. But before I will go presenting this now, I would like to explain what's the difference between exploratory scenarios and the target-based scenario. Exploratory scenario, actually, we are looking to the future and we say what could happen. It can be this scenario, this or that. The target-based scenario is a bit different. We actually identify point in the future, and then we start to backcasting to see how we can reach to this point. So based on our study, we succeeded to create 4 exploratory scenarios. The first scenario is the regenerative, locally focused scenario. This scenario shows a strong move toward local blue food system. It's driven by local, social, and environmental value, but at the same time, it's require national level systematic change, include new management methods and structure, include empowering local politicians by granting them more authority. And in summary, this scenario is small is beautiful. The second scenario is centralized high-tech industry food production. This is actually driven by market, and there is a strong government role in this scenario. It's heavily invested in high-tech ocean food production, and this will lead to a biotechnology-driven solution. It's capital intensive. There is a lot of money here in this scenario. Energy intensive. And it's emphasized large scale and centralized process and industry mechanisms. And in this scenario, actually, we decouple food production from the land and animal into the ocean through using technology, robotic, and AI. Scenario number 3 is a strong economic growth with no transition. Unfortunately, this is the worst scenario, and this is business as usual. So it's continuous emphasis on economic growth and increased ocean seafloor production using existing technology, using existing infrastructure and knowledge. Focus on expanding existing industry. It's actually, as you see here, it's the worst one. So actually, we don't take any action toward our environment. The 4th scenario is a conservation scenario, and here there is a strong role for the government. So actually, in this scenario, Norway deliver on the goal of restoring 30% of the ecosystem in North Norway. The high percentage of protected area result in less allocation of space to traditional salmon farming, and this is the difference between this scenario and the first one. In first one, it's based on local value, local industry, but here actually it's just predict everything. So actually here there is no business. All the business will go somewhere south or somewhere else. Circular and local food system are not predominant here, but production increase coastal fish stock for local fishery. And I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that interesting talk. Next up is Raul Primicero. He's a professor at UIT, and he will have a talk about challenging and options for the integrated management of Arctic ecosystems under climate change.
A general topic that was introduced yesterday during a side event. It was a side event organized by the Fram Center program CLEAN. We heard the Coast Shift program now introduced by Kate Dunlop. CLEAN does something similar. So in a sense, it's looking into multiple stressors, but it covers different ecosystems, including terrestrial, freshwater, and marine, coastal, and Barents Sea and Svalbard. And during the said event, we discussed some of the challenges of sustainable management of multiple stresses and cumulative risk. And the climate change stands out as one prominent challenge. During the said event, we could not go in the depth of the, let's say, the processes that make climate change such a problem when dealing with managing integrated management of cumulative risk. During the said event, what we did was to provide an overview of some of the challenges. Some of the challenges are related to the governance and management regime, so they're more related to fragmentation of governance and management regimes. There are problems with science policy interactions. But then climate change, again, was mentioned. What I'll do today is to go more in depth into the effects of climate change, and particularly this idea of climate change compounding the cumulative risk from multiple stresses. That's a central topic that we want to cover today. And within this context, I will touch on risk. So with both Kate and other speakers today, we visited risk, looking at different definitions, but also ways of assessing risk. Now, historically and also recently, still presently, risk, which depends on the type of human activities and hazards related to those, are in a given area. It depends on the exposure, as Katie Dunlop was explaining to us, and this sensitivity, vulnerability also, of species or ecosystem components in a system. Now, these three components are together defining cumulative risk, and they can be, cumulative risk can emerge from direct effects. These are shown here. So these are the direct effects of the fishery sales, of the shipping that were discussed during several talks today. These are important and are also the basis for the type of integrated risk assessments that we've seen both within Coast Shift and in other efforts. This ODEM approach is based on direct effects. So you look at the impact pathways that go from a sector and human activity through the pressures to the ecosystem components. Now, these are important and need to be addressed. So we look into integrated risk assessment models. You may wonder why this insistence on integrated risk assessment. Well, these are the tools for decision support tools, essentially, to make decisions about integrated management. So they're crucial to inform management. And it emerges from if you want to check with your chatbot, favorite chatbot, if you ask what are the main challenges nowadays, with regard to integrated management, the answer is good integrated, so development of integrated risk assessment models that inform management. Okay, so that's one main challenge we face when dealing with integrated management across sectors. The other dimension of cumulative risk is related to indirect effects. These are typically not included in the existing integrated risk assessment models. So what we did do essentially with the effects that are mediated through the ecology, food webs, relationship between species and components of an ecosystem is to ignore them in the risk assessments, that's status today, or account for them but indirectly. So they're not, in a way, they're not introduced in this computation of risk, okay? And that is a big challenge nowadays. And one other reason is that one effect of climate change is to modify the indirect effects of multiple stresses. So two ingredients for a sustainable management of multiple stresses are integrated management, so this cross-sector perspective that were discussed in previous talks, and the other is this ecosystem approach to management that opens up for the indirect effects from multiple stresses. And then we have problems related to climate change. So we'll see how to handle that in the following slides. So climate change, as we said, compounds cumulative risk, so it's a big issue and a big challenge for the integrated management of cumulative risk. We're going to focus on examples from coastal areas in Norway and Barents Sea. These are case studies within the Clean Fram Center program. And when we look into the direct effects then of climate change, what is interesting is that they modify the hazards, the exposure, and the sensitivity of species to those hazards. So the problem is that through redistribution of species, the exposure changes between hazards and the species, the ecosystem components, and then the sensitivity of those species may change due to climate change. Okay, so these are crucial issues that need to be addressed when integrating climate change in our assessments. Two examples, we see the effects of redistributions along the coast of Norway. We heard from Coast Shift what are the plans with regard to human activities for the future. Well, we can see what is happening to the ecosystem here. If you look on the left-hand side, you will see what the species diversity, so the richness of fish was along the coast in the 90s. In the 90s, we still had a relatively cool climate in this area, and there was a traditional gradient, so more species in the south, less species in the north, and it has been as that for many, many years. But then during the last 20 years, there's been a redistribution of species northward due to climate warming. That has happened very fast, and now we see a doubling. So there is an increase in species richness on the right-hand side, which is, more than doubles the number of species at stations. There are new species in the north, and this is affecting fisheries, it's affecting the side effects of aquaculture, and so forth. Okay, so these are important issues. They change the exposure, but also the let's say, the ecosystem organization, if we want, okay? The other example is from the Barents Sea. Here again, we've seen redistribution of species, again with fish as a potential target for management. We see in 2004, there was still a clear segregation, if you want, in the south, in Atlantic waters of more boreal fish species, and then in the north, more Arctic species in blue, okay? And then by 2017, a northward distribution of boreal species changed this pattern, zoogeographic pattern. So big changes, quick changes that reorganize the ecosystem again. And that will affect the indirect effects of multiple stresses. So that's the next topic. So climate change reorganizes the food webs in our systems. By so doing, it alters the cumulative risk. So there is a compounding of the risk, but it also modifies what is called a systemic risk. So it changes the structure of an ecosystem and changes to what extent that ecosystem is prone to the pressures from human activities, for example. And these two topics we'll discuss more in depth now. So along the coast of Norway, as we see a redistribution of species, what happens is that we change the co-occurrence of species, the coexistence we are talking about in this session, but the co-occurrence of species, and that modifies food web structure. Okay, so we change the indirect links between species that mediate the impact of multiple stresses indirectly. Okay, so we see an example here. There is an increase of co-occurrence of many species in the north, and that rewires our food webs. That's for the coastal area. For the Barents Sea, again, the northward shift of species has introduced more species in the north. So when we go from the left, from 2004, a cooler period, to 2017, a much warmer period, there are new species coming into the Arctic. They bring new feeding links within the food web, and that tends to connect more tightly the food web and modify structural properties of that food web. So here is just a short summary of what is happening to food webs, so to the very structural properties of an ecosystem that mediate indirect effects of multiple stressors. A short summary of what it means that, also what it implies that boreal general species are coming in. This is a short overview based on a number of papers we have published in the past on this specific issue of food web reorganization and then indirect effects of multiple stressors. There are a number of effects. The redistribution of general species tends to multiply the number of indirect impact pathways that affect an ecosystem. They shorten it. So what we see is that there are fewer links needed to connect one target species to fisheries, for example, to some other component of the ecosystem. These general species typically establish new indirect pathways among species that were originally separate with regard to food web compartment, for example, benthic versus pelagic species. They change food webs from, these are properties of food web that affect how the impact of pressures may operate, from bottom-up to waste, so from strictly bottom-up in the Arctic to top-down and bottom-up mediated effects. And then finally, there is a decrease in properties like modularity, connectance, nestedness that affect systemic risk, what we called the systemic risk of our ecosystems. Okay, so these are all influencing the indirect impact on multiple stresses. So we need then 3 ingredients to sustainably manage our ecosystem: integrated management, ecosystem approach to management, and the adaptive management that is invited by this session. So we need to incorporate climate adaptations, and these need to account for multiple stresses. So to conclude, in order to then, let's say, emancipate our understanding of cumulative risk, we need to integrate climate effects as well. We need to think about indirect effects, also in our integrated risk assessment models. And we conclude with the idea that climate change now modifies direct and indirect effects of these multiple anthropogenic stresses. The climate-driven food web reorganization then affects indirect effects. Okay, so it's affecting interactions between stresses and systemic risk. And finally, the integrated risk assessments that are the basis for the decision support tools, if you want, should include effects from climate change and account for these indirect effects and indirect impact pathways we discussed, and the sources of interaction between stresses that tend to emerge from food webs. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And then I would like to invite the last speaker of this session, Małgorzata Zmiszek-Rice. She's a researcher at UIT, and she will talk about assessing cumulative impacts of climate change and potential oil pollutions in the Arctic. Welcome.
Can you hear me? Yes, I guess you can. Thank you very much. Thank you for this introduction. Good afternoon. Apologies right up front for my voice. It is not how it usually is. So as said, I'm just going to provide in this brief presentation the overview of the project that is actually run by Institute of Marine Research, where we as UIT are taking part of, and action project deals in general with assessing cumulative impacts of climate change and potential oil spills in the Arctic. And I realize this is a little bit unfortunate, but here in this first slide, I am only a presenter, but actually for those of you who are more interested in the specific modeling parts of the project, there is a list of persons working with it, as they are definitely the better ones to address some of the questions you might have. And now I'm, if I'll go this, yes. So ACTION stands, ACTION is the Arctic Ecosystem Impact Assessment of Oil and Ice under Climate Change project funded by the Research Council of Norway. And actually, as I've already mentioned, well, the main aim of the project is to examine cumulative impact of climate change and oil pollution on key Arctic species, and with emphasizing particularly polar cod in its early life stages. And to achieve that, ACTION is developing data-driven mechanistic models, which are both based on field and lab experiments. And our hope and ambition altogether with this project, and here you can see the brief overview of this, is that through developing this tool, the idea is to provide more accurate and specific information to both governments, but also oil companies, operators, when they are developing both regulatory measures and operational standards for their developments further in the north. When we were picking locations originally for development of oil models specifically, we chose Wisting as the southernmost location of potential oil spill here for the model. Even though at this point picking Wisting might feel, well, the situation has changed over last year. Wisting was actually very much discussed at the time when we were starting to work on the project. So for those of you less familiar with it, Wisting, if it becomes realized, will be actually the northernmost operated field in the world, and it was proven, its discovery was proven in 2013, then it was delineated in 2016, 2017, and as said, when we were starting the project, the development was set to go forward. The situation changed in November last year when it was decided that development of Wisting, the decision is postponed until 2026. But nonetheless, given how far at the offshore developments in the north we are looking at, that felt very relevant to the field. But actually what I wanted to highlight, and I do realize this is maybe slightly different from other presentations here in this session, is actually the work package 4 that we are working with. It focuses specifically on the institutional context and science policy interface when it comes to this work. So those are first 3 work packages that work with the models. But as we were developing the project, we realized that when it comes to discussions on science policy interface, which of course are extremely relevant because it's ultimately the question of how results of our research can be picked up and can be part of the process, we do realize that actually in the literature, what we've seen, a lot of focus has been on integrated management plans in Norway. And of course, for very right reasons. And now we are expecting the next revision of the management plan. In our case, the relevant one is, of course, for Lofoten Barents Sea. But of course, they cover all Norwegian marine areas. Nonetheless, the point was that even though so much research has been done specifically on the management plans, but also, for instance, on the risk assessments related to oil spills and so on, when we look at the management of regular operations of oil industry, management plans, they play only one very specific role. Namely, if you look into the context of into the content of the management plans, they define which areas are off limits for oil development. They also say in which time periods there cannot be drilling, and they also define, which is very important, particularly vulnerable and sensitive areas. However, at this point, the role basically ends. And for us, that was actually something important, that even though it's, of course, that's one aspect, it's actually, they don't play that much role in the, so to say, daily, or actually we could say annual operations of offshore petroleum development in Norway. And of course, this one is the most basic slide. But what is really important with this one, of course, given the massive size of the petroleum industry in Norway, and of course, not only in the monetary terms, but also in terms of number of employments, it is actually its continued expansion. And we've heard this already in other sessions, but even, well, just two weeks back, it was once another round of licenses was announced, where 62 licenses were announced for the companies, and 8 of them are in the Barents Sea. In the Barents Sea, it was actually for the first time in 2017 that we've seen more exploration wells than in the North Sea. So this really makes the discussion even more pertinent. And of course, what we mentioned, well, the Barents Sea, why we are looking at this, and of course, well, one of the questions is some of the most rapid and substantial climate-driven changes that we are observing in the Barents Sea, but it is actually identified by Norwegian Petroleum Directorate as the most prospective region for future petroleum development. So this is really where a lot of development is expected. So going back for a moment to free work packages in our project. It is Met Norway that contributes with the ensemble prediction system of 2.5 K resolution, and they are working. So the EPS works with surface waves, sea ice, and ocean circulation. SINTEF is working on oil spill models here, and IMR is working on the biophysical transport of polar code, and also we have collaborators from US that support this data. As said, as you probably realize how briefly I presented this, I cannot provide you many more details, but I'm sure they will be very happy to discuss that. Anyways, what we are looking now at, and maybe I should have started the presentation, this is really our work in early stages, so I don't know how much time there will be for discussion, but also any input will be much valued here, because it's really our basic question is now as banal as it sounds. It appeared there is no obvious answer to that. Thank you. Is that does the existing construction of the science policy interface related to Norway's offshore petroleum activities actually account for the nature of scientific inquiry, and does it allow for scientific information to be properly taken into account? And so some of the issues are complexity of ecosystems, as we are moving more to ecosystem understanding on the scientific part. Is this really the information that can penetrate more into regulatory procedures? Just to put very brief here. So our focus is now on actually examining steps that are listed in Petroleum Act from 1996, which is the general legal basis, and this is actually really what runs the industry on the, I don't want to say daily basis, but at least when it comes to annual basis. And then looking at the decision-making process, actually opening of an area, it's just the first part of the process, but it's really in the licensing rounds, and this is the step we're conducting right now for interviews with various stakeholders, is the extent to understand to how models that we are developing, the knowledge that is being constantly upgraded, provided, whether it can actually be accounted for in this process, given that rounds and that handing out of licenses and development is happening. With this, I think I'm almost out of time. As said, this work is very much at this point in early stages, but we would very much welcome any input to this, and if I can direct you to all others when it comes to questions related to models, that would be my preference. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Now I think we have some time for some questions. Maybe all the speakers can come up to stage, and we can pass around the microphone if people have some questions. There's one question. Yeah.
Thank you. I have an outsider question. I'm an international lawyer, and whenever we deal with how to approach conservation, we often refer to best available science as a concept which has diffuse boundaries. And in some of these presentations, so it's not a specific question, but it's maybe a bit to all of you, I've heard some interesting questions about how knowledge is produced, which raises some question marks from my point of view. The issue of method, for example, and how that can change significantly the outputs of research, and so the nature and value of the information. We're very interested in the expert elicitation frameworks, which you also characterize as guessing, which is also very interesting. But also the trade-offs that may be very large between accuracy and calculability in terms of simplification that's needed in order to arrive at a workable result. So I just wonder, and this is part of an important element of how then knowledge is constructed, acquired, packaged, and transmitted. And the more this is visible and legible, the more this opens for a lot of political determinations in the way that knowledge is rendered, actionable. So the larger the uncertainties, the larger is the politics involved into taking decisions, at management and legal level. So I wanted to raise this question from an outside point of view, and I know we can't have certain knowledge, but these kind of things stood out when I was listening, so I wanted to.
So, thanks, Vito. The problem really is one about harmonization. So there is little harmonization across assessment approaches. We discussed some examples today. And you could already see the diversity of approaches. There is expert knowledge base, there are quantitative assessment and so forth. And in the development of this type of let's call them integrated assessment models, there is a lot of method involved. The lack of harmonization produces big issues here. So the fact that within CLIN we try to harmonize just across 5 cases, and we realized that on the one hand there weren't any integrated assessment to begin with, and now that we try to establish them, there is little harmony across terrestrial approaches, freshwater approaches, marine approaches. So that's a big challenge. There is no mandate, there is no guideline from the policy, from management about what the assessment models should look like. There are ingredients. That's what we have, right? And the dialogue then with management and policy is needed to move towards more, let's call them more harmonized, coherent ways of assessing risk.
I can add something to what Raoul said. I think it's very important to have this transparency of what the method was that you used. Something that we do in our methods, I didn't mention this, we have a measure of uncertainty. And I think there's also a lot, when you have these very complex methods, finding good ways to explain the method is challenging, but I think something we have to do so then it's understandable of where the results came from.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for the question. I think one of the, I'll just add a little bit as well here. One of the major barriers, and you just put your fingers on here, one of the major barriers to both national and especially international policy is this constant chasing between the knowledge producers are saying, well, we never have enough knowledge. But the policy makers, you need some kind of policy. So there's this cyclical, well, we haven't got enough knowledge, and well, we're going to have to implement a policy anyway. And then it goes around like the European Marine Strategy Framework Directive. It does have a cyclical, so you can see where the policies don't work, and then you try to get that knowledge. And one of the simplified things I was trying to put is it's very, very obvious that in Southern Europe, the policies, one of the barriers is that we're trying to make one international policy, and it's not appropriate across the whole of Europe. Or at least it's in a general terms appropriate, but on a national level, it doesn't work in the same way across the whole of Europe. And that's what our project's about.
Yes. And I think I'm going from all these systems, the big picture and so on, and to the very, very basic biology, which we mustn't lose track of. Because there is this pressure for, coming with the big picture, and for a species like harbor it's so widespread, so in so many conflict areas, and you need this information quick, so you don't go into the nitty-gritty of the old methods that are, written up in old protocols. But we just discovered that there are different practices based on the same references. And it does make a difference. So we mustn't lose track of that. And harbor porpoises, I mean, that's a common species, and a species that you can get samples of and so on. Then there are other species like white whales, narwhals, much harder to get knowledge about.
Thank you very much to everyone. And sorry, we have to wrap up. There's a new session now in 10 minutes, so we need to leave the room. But I want to thank all of the speakers today and also the ones online. I'm sorry in the beginning that it was a bit of a mess with the technology, but thanks again for everyone.